All right, so now we're going to look at some of the systems that are on the car. We're going to start with the cooling system. We're going to have another lesson on this after this that's more in-depth to the cooling system. So your cooling system's job is to pull the heat out of the engine. It's also to give us heat, right, in the when the temperature's cold. So your main pieces are the radiator, which is right here, the thermostat that's right here because we need to be able to get the temperature to a certain point and we need to keep it at a certain point. Your radiator hoses that the coolant flows through. The coolant recovery tank. What happens to fluids when they get hot, right? They expand, so we need a place for that to go. We have heater hoses that bring this up into our heater core, which is inside our dashboard that gives us heat. We have a water pump that's involved in circulating this coolant. We have coolant passages that flow all the way around the engine block and around the pistons and whatnot to pull the heat out. We have a cooling fan, right? It could be electric or it could be belt driven. And actually some cars have hydraulic cooling fans. And then coolant, antifreeze, which has a whole lot of technology in it also, right? So anybody know how much antifreeze this car takes? It's air cooled. It's a Corvair. It doesn't have any, like an old Volkswagen Beetle. So if you want to drive someone crazy, ask them to check the coolant level in your Volkswagen or your Chevy Corvair. So basically what happens is the coolant picks up the heat from the engine. After the thermostat opens, the water pump circulates the coolant through the radiator, where excess heat is released into the outside air, cooling the coolant. Coolant is continually circulated through the cooling system, and the temperature is controlled by the thermostat, which is right in here. And again, we'll go into that much more detail next lesson. All right, so we got our lubrication system, which moves along with the oil changes that we had done. This will go into a little more detail too when we talk about oils, which we'll do shortly as well. So you have your engine. Down in the bottom, you have your oil pan that holds it. You'll have your strainer or your sump that's used to draw the oil up. Somewhere off of the crankshaft, generally speaking, we have the oil pump that's driven by the crankshaft to draw the oil through that strainer. That oil then flows into the oil filter, where then it's then filtered out and pumped up into this giant spider web of oil galleys through the engine block and through the components to deposit oil on each individual surface that needs lubrication. Naturally, if you have a blockage like over here, right, it will deprive certain areas from getting oil, and that will lead to oil failure. The interesting part is the oil pump is the only part of the engine that runs without filtered oil. Everything else is being delivered fresh filtered oil after the filter. And you'll see that when we do our lesson of oil changes. Now, if you notice this type of a system, right, what happens if you accelerate real fast? Right? The oil swishes back and the strainer gets deprived of oil. What happens when you corner? That oil smushes up against the sidewall. Right? If anybody here has watched Hoovie's Garage, you'll saw where he did Apollo 911. He did a Porsche 911 that he put a Chevy V8 in it backwards. Well, he took it to the track and he killed the engine. Why? The engine was never meant for the oil slit to swish to the front. It was meant to go to the back because that's where accelerated forces are. So they had to do something to allow cars to have these extreme angles. Think about rock crawlers, right? These four-wheel drive things that ride up mountain faces. So we have what's called dry sump systems. Right? This is oil that is not pumped into the engine from the oil pan. It's pumped in from a reservoir. So this way, no matter what you do, it can get it. And this video down here is when the C6 Corvette, the Grand Sport's got a dry sump system, which all Corvettes do from that point forward. So I want you to see what's involved in a dry sump system. And once again, we got a little delay until it shows up on YouTube. Here it comes.
I'm John Rzuski, Assistant Chief Engineer for Small Block. I'd like to talk about the LS3 for the Corvette Grand Sport. This right here is the base LS3 introduced in the Corvette in 2008, and we've made a few modifications of this engine specifically for the Grand Sport manual transmission to enhance the performance capability of the vehicle and the engine. And the big change we've made is the addition of a dry sump system. This tank right here is the dry sump tank. It's a 10.5 quart capacity tank, and it's really it's the same tank that's also used on the Z06
Imagine
and the
that tank's
ZR1
in a Corvette.
reused on this application. The main function of the dry sump tank is to contain oil and condition the oil so that oil being fed into the engine does not have air, does not have PCV gases, and can be effectively used by the loop system to maintain the performance of the engine. This is the oil pan, which is unique for the dry sump LS3, and the oil pan has a couple stage pump that attaches onto the oil pan, and this is it right here. There is a one stage for suction, which sucks air and oil out of the oil pan, and another stage is for high pressure oil, which pulls the oil from the dry sump. So the path of oil from the oil pan is from the suction tube, which is located right here as the vehicle goes through the extensive dynamics back and forth. There's potential for air to be entrained in the oil as the pickup tube gets exposed to air. Well, this air-oil mixture will be pulled up from the pickup tube along this cast-in passage, and it would then migrate into the suction side of the oil pump. The oil pump will then pump that air-oil mixture back through a passage in the casting, through some lines, into the bottom of the dry sump tank. From there, the air-oil mixture routes through a tube in the center of the tank and comes up to the top of this tank, where the air-oil mixture is then exposed to a tangential separator that runs along the entire cylinder, and the purpose here is to let the air oil migrate downward into the liquid section of the oil. The air will separate, the oil will cool, and the oil will eventually make its way down to the lower portion of the tank. So now you have a head of conditioned, filtered, or not filtered, conditioned oil that gets pulled from the other port back into the pump, and the pump then pumps this conditioned oil through the oil cooler, through the filter, and back into the engine. So with this dry sump system, you now have oil that's at a higher pressure. It's of a much higher quality. The vehicle is able to perform the vehicle maneuvers that are much more aggressive, and the engine is able to be very durable with that conditioned oil. So all this is part of the dry sump system. One of the other additions we did have to make to the LS3 is we did have to go to a steel crank and extend the nose of the crank to actually fit the dual stage pump. Other than that, we basically have the rest of the components are similar to the LS3. This engine is produced in Wixom. The engines are hand built, similar to the LS7, LS9, individually built and signed by the engine builders.